Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. All right, everybody. This week, we're going to start things off with a little bit of a pop quiz. Hang with me on this. Do you guys remember back in the 90s and the console wars were going on with all the video game systems? And the number one weapon in the console wars that they used was bits. You know, it had Nintendo came out, the NES had 4-bit system, was an 8-bit system. And then Sega Genesis came out and it was 16 bits. And then SNES had matched the 16 bits, and then they even started moving them into the names. Like Sega Genesis had the 32X connection, and then you have Nintendo 64. And really at the time, or at least for people as old as I was, none of us knew what bits were. We just knew it made things better. So here's the pop quiz. How many bits did it take to spurn the outrage over violence in video games for the first time? Fun fact, it was 0. The game in question was Death Race from 1976. There was no CPU. It was just hardwired discrete logic boards, but that's not why it's on the show today, obviously. It's because it was the first major video game controversy. Just to give you a little background on the game itself in case you've never seen it, the cabinet was an upright cabinet with a steering wheel, a gas pedal, and a gear shift that would move you from forward to reverse for each one of the 2 players involved. It had this amazing cabinet art on it of these Grim Reaper types in dune buggies running throughout a graveyard with this vulture sitting on top of a casket. And the game itself was a black and white screen with very simplistic graphics. It was a 2-player racing game. You played as a tiny little car that drove around and hit what looked like, especially by the graphical standards of the time, people. Each time you hit a person, it would let out a little digital scream and turn into a cross, which would stay on the screen as an obstacle. Generally, 1 quarter bought you 99 seconds, and each person you hit got you a point. The object of the game, of course, was to run over as many people as you could. It should be noted that on the game art itself and in the promotional material and in the operator's manual, they never referred to the characters running around on screen as people. Instead, they referred to them as gremlins. In fact, according to the service manual, gremlins are, and this is a quote, intelligent robots in every sense. So I guess it was probably okay to feed them after midnight. Now, I know some of my fellow B-movie fans might be wondering, and this game is not to be confused with the classic Roger Corman 1975 B-movie Death Race 2000 that starred Sylvester Stallone and David Carradine and had the 2008 remake just simply called Death Race with the most confusing line of all time in it. You could check the episode notes if you want a link to that. But officially, the game makers said it was just a coincidence that they released a game about killing things, or about killing people, or gremlins, a year after this movie was released. Although it kind of becomes hard to deny because the working title for the game, used in some early promos, was Death Race 98, which almost makes it sound like a prequel. Now, just to give us an idea of in time where we're talking about, this game started shipping April 1st, 1976. That is only 4 years after Pong started releasing. So Pong, though not technically the first video game, the one we kind of realize is the first video game, we're only talking about 4 years from that to major controversy. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up there was another smaller controversy that preceded Death Race by about 3 years, and that game was called Gotcha. It was released by Atari in 1973. It was a maze game where one player would chase the other. And the joysticks were originally encapsulated in these pink rubber domes that were supposed to represent boobs. The production designer, George Franco, admits they were designed like that as a joke because joysticks look so phallic. This even led to inspiring the advertising flyer that had a man playfully chasing a woman in a nightie, although they quickly abandoned the whole booby controllers things and went to regular joysticks. In fact, I can't even find an image of the machine outside of that original flyer that has the original pink dome booby controllers. But that whole thing passed with relatively little coverage. The game was produced by a company called Exidy. Exidy at the time was actually kind of a distant third to some of the bigger arcade giants like Atari and Midway. It was an abbreviation for excellence in dynamics, and it was the brainchild of one Pete Kaufman, who had left his previous company, Ramtech, to start this one. It's also worth noting at this point that he was one of the founders of Ramtech, which had recently started to branch into video games itself, but was mainly in the business of developing and producing video monitors for computer use, but also medical use. Early on, Exidy had somewhat of a hit with a game called Destruction Derby. It became so popular that they had to devote their entire, albeit small, production line to making the game. In an effort to free up their production line, they licensed the title to a company called Chicago Coin Inc., who released it as Demolition Derby. As per the contract, Exidy would have to stop producing their version of the game and would take a percentage of the Chicago coin sales as a way to not compete. There was one small problem. Chicago Coin had been struggling a bit in the financial department. They declared bankruptcy in 1976 without having made a single royalty payment, essentially stiffing Exidy on that. So Exidy's hands were a little bit tied. They had this game, it was a big hit, but they couldn't make it anymore. Down but not out, Exidy came up with a series of 3 decisions. First off, no more licensing. They saw how big their game can be, and they wanted to take home all the money. That led to their second decision, which was buying a 15,000 square foot facility to up their production game. And the third decision they made would be to make a new video game based off Destruction Derby. That game was Death Race. Howell Ivey was the man who came on to make the modifications to Destruction Derby. Howell Ivey had recently been hired away from Ramtech, where he had developed, amongst other games, a game called Clean Sweep, which many people in the arcade community consider a kind of spiritual successor to Atari's Breakout. Breakout, of course, being the game where you slide the paddle along the bottom and the ball bounces up and breaks the blocks. Ramtech itself didn't have much time left in the video game arena. They'd faced an earlier setback in 1974 when their $7 million manufacturing plant had burnt to the ground. And to make matters worse, it was during a time when they had accidentally let their insurance lapse. And as big as a setback as that was, the main problem was their games weren't just selling. At least they weren't selling enough to cover the cost, especially with the monitors doing so well. They even had a really big hit with a game called Boomball, which for my fellow Chuck E. Cheese in the 80s, 90s kids was that game where you had like the little cannon and you'd like a row of 9 clowns and you'd shoot off the rubber balls at the clowns and knock them over. They had the other version where it was the clown's teeth and you'd knock out that stupid fucking clown's teeth. It was aggressive. Which was actually a big hit, something a lot of us grew up with. But even that couldn't make the company's game division popular enough to sustain itself. So they sold it. Luckily, Boomball was saved when another founding member named Mel McEwen left the company to start another company called Meltech I know, creative name, and continued to produce the game, which is how we got it into the Chuck E. Cheeses of our youth. We're about to kind of get into the controversy that Death Race stirred up, but we should take a moment to recognize that Destruction Derby itself was a really unique idea for a game at the time. Most of the other driving games were racing games. Destruction Derby was a game where you drove around and hit other cars. That was really unique. But by the time they were going to take Destruction Derby and change it into Death Race, John Metzler, who was the one who originally designed it, had left Exidy to start his own company, leaving Howell Ivey to make the conversion. Remember that fun little fact from the beginning of the episode where we talked about there was no CPU, therefore no bits? Well, as it turns out, that kind of hardwired game is very difficult to change in terms of gameplay. But, to quote Howell Ivey himself, to just change the images, that's not so hard. He went on to say, I realized I could change the cars to people. When they got run over, well, I couldn't have a dead body, but how about just a cross? That's how Death Race was born. He did make some other small adjustments, including adding curbs to the left and the right of the screen that gremlins could cross over, but the player couldn't, so you'd be chasing one, and then you'd be stopped, and he would just run away. And he also made it so that you can drive up the top of the screen and come out the bottom, and vice versa. Now, here's one of the funny things about Death Race. All throughout the promotion of the game, including appearing in industry trades like Playmeter, Replay, and Vending Times, and up to its initial release, Death Race actually didn't make much of a stir. It kind of came and went and was just considered a regular video game. All that changed, however, when one Wendy Walker was strolling through the Seattle Center. As she walked by the arcade, she saw a line of kids around a certain machine. That machine? Death Race. Of course it's Death Race. That's what this episode's about. It'd be dumb if it was anything else but Death Race. She was not only immediately taken aback by the morbidity of the game, but also the fact that it was being played by children. Now, in a time before the internet, one had less outlets to express their dismay for, let's say, the perceived corruption of American youth. But luckily for Wendy, she was a reporter with the Associated Press. So she wrote an article, and of course, depending on which paper it came out in, it got different titles. Some of my favorites being New Game, Chase Pedestrians. But in the article, she refers to the screaming mechanic as being, quote, something like the scream of a child, end quote. She also interviewed one Bertie Meeks, a psychologist from Seattle, who once worked with aggressive inmates at San Quentin Prison. She was quoted as saying in the article that a game like that appeals to the morbidity in a person. That type of preoccupation with violence was common in the prisoners I dealt with. They would have loved the game. Scary, right? That last part was me. Exidy's director of marketing, Paul Jacobs, a transplant from Chicago Coin, the company that had originally bought Destruction Derby to make Demolition Derby, was quoted in the article saying, if people get a kick out of running down pedestrians, you have to let them do it. Interestingly, another person she interviewed in the article was actually the owner of the arcade. But at first, he didn't know what game she was talking about, pointing out that he hadn't received any complaints about it. But when he looked into the game, he came back with, and I quote here, those are gremlins you run down. You're not supposed to think they're people. Now, in the media coverage that would follow, Paul Jacobs and crew would flip to taking more of the arcade owner's stance on it and kind of try and drop the it's just harmless fun and switch over to, no, the reports are mistaken. You don't run over people in this game. And there were many more articles written. Newsweek, Playboy, National Enquirer, National Observer, the New York Times, NBC News, and even Germany jumped in on the act in their publication called Midnight. Now, while the AP article was the first that caught the the national media's attention and international media's attention. It was given a boost when the National Safety Council released an article about it in their magazine, Family Safety, which was kind of like their quarterly magazine for members. And that, in turn, spurned another write-up about it in the AP. In the Family Safety article, they make the claim that, quote, one of the most insidious and probably unrecognized characteristics is its shift from imaginary visual images of destruction, as you would see in TV violence, to actual behavioral actions taken by the player. The person is no longer just a spectator, but now an actor in the process of creating violence. Now, all of this stuff at the time was very new, but to us, it sounds very familiar. Also, I'm just curious as to what actual violence they were creating in playing this game, but that's besides the point. Oddly, one thing that came up again and again in some of these articles, dating back to the very first one, is the arcade owners generally weren't receiving any customer complaints and were more concerned about the media controversy surrounding the game. I think that Bo Wilder, who was a 13-year-old, said it best at the time when he was asked about the possibility of acquiring violent tendencies from the game in a Los Angeles Times article on August 10th, 1997. He said, "That's stupid, and besides, I don't even know how to drive." God, I love kids. That kid is after my own heart. Of course, then politicians jumped on board. One U.S. House representative member, Bob Bowman from Maryland, called it, quote, the most heinous form of pornography that one can level against the younger, impressionable citizens who are likely to play these kinds of games. It should be noted that a few years later in 1980, Mr. Bowman would be charged with soliciting sex from a 16-year-old prostitute. But it didn't stop at the politicians either. Even Nolan Bushnell, the creator of Atari, and here's a little fun fact, he created Chuck E. Cheese. Double fun fact, the E in Chuck E. Cheese stands for entertainment. So Chuck E. Cheese's given name was Charles Entertainment Cheese. Just keep that in your noggin. But Bushnell piled on, adding in an interview years later, we were really unhappy with that game. We had an internal rule that we wouldn't allow violence against people. You could blow up a tank or blow up a flying saucer, but you couldn't blow up people. We felt that was not good form, and we adhered to that all during my tenure. Now, it should be noted that while Mr. Nolan Bushnell never slept with minors, that statement he made isn't actually entirely true. Our Atari had made a game called Outlaw for arcade and the 2600, which was an Old West gunslinging duel where you were supposed to shoot the opponent. But when all was said and done, at the end of the day, all of the controversy just helped the game's sales. As Jacobs put it, we had only released 200 games, but after the notoriety, we ended up making around 3,000, including PCB sales overseas. He added, I did interviews for many U.S. radio stations and also both CBC, which is the Canadian station, and BBC, obviously the British stations. It was a story that wouldn't die, and Exidy laughed all the way to the bank. But the story did eventually die. By the end of 1977, Death Race had fallen out of the headlines. In 1975, the year before Exidy had released the game, their sales were at about $250,000. In 1976, the year that they had reached the game, they had reached about $3 million. They did make a follow-up to Death Race called Super Death Chase. That was basically the same games with a few minor alterations. They had a skull that came in that was worth bonus points, but that game never made it into production. There was only a few cabinets made, and it made a brief appearance at the 1977 Amusement and Music Operators Association show. In fact, very few of the machines are actually left behind. Some places where you can still find them in the wild are the Galloping Ghost Arcade in Brookfield, Illinois, which from all accounts is one of the biggest arcades still left in operation. Fun Spot in Laconia, New Hampshire, which actually has a weird variation in an all-yellow cabinet. And the Musée Mécanique in San Francisco, which is actually where I got to play the game. It was cool because you go in and it has mostly all these kind of animatronic things that you run for a corner. And I was walking to the back and I saw it there. I had no idea it was there beforehand. And I got to play the game that became the first uproar of violence over video games. And like most video games, I loved it and didn't do very well at it. And a lot of times with older video games like this, especially the rare ones, where they find a second life is on emulators. But remember that fun fact from earlier, there was no CPU in this machine, which meant that there was no software to dump. So as far as I know, there's still no emulated version of this game. Now there is a company that goes by the name Binary Software, which is basically just a dude named Chris Malcolm in Glasgow, Scotland, who made his own port of the game for the Vectrex System. For those of you not familiar with the Vectrex System, the Vectrex was a very short-lived video game system that was vector-based, and the TV was actually part of it. He programmed his one, and it's actually, I've seen video of it. I haven't had a chance to play that one. It's actually a pretty cool little version of it, complete with little digital art that he made and a plastic overlay for the screen, which was something that happened a lot with Vectrex systems. In 1990, a video game company called American Game Cartridges released a remake on the NES. Now, I know a lot of you might be saying NES was very famous for not allowing violent video games. This was an unlicensed version, and it is way different than the original. There's several levels. You're fighting helicopters. It really leans into the fact that you're supposed to be running over and shooting people. It has almost an RPG element where you can build up your car. But being an unlicensed video game, didn't sell a lot of copies. Kind of a rarity nowadays. In the end of the day, Death Race may be nearly forgotten, but it laid out the playbook on video game violence controversies that we see played out over and over and over again. And before I go, one last fun fact. I'll miss you guys. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach. And please like, comment, subscribe. And if you donate blood, come join our Band Media Podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.